The Republicans are in pretty bad shape. I mean, the Trumpified Republican Party is all kinds of, wires hanging from the ceiling, contradictory things they stand for. They don't have much of a policy agenda. They're divided. But despite all this, the Democrats are sort of fighting them to a draw at this point. Hello out there in podcast land. I'm your host for this edition of the Liberal Patriot podcast. I'm Ruy Teixeira. And, every couple of weeks we try to bring to you the very finest and heterodox conversation and analysis with the most interesting and provocative guests. And today I'm very happy to have Julius Krein here to chat with us. Julius is editor of the American Affairs magazine, which to my mind is probably the best and most stimulating of all the intellectual journals that are out there today. Pretty much every issue is chock full of interesting stuff to read and, sometimes coming from unpredictable directions. And I think Julius himself, if I may compliment you, even though you're right in front of me, I think you're one of the most interesting, stimulating, analytical, political and policy minds around. And I always find everything you write to be of great interest. I think people may know this, but they may not, that you originally, back in the very early days of the Trump phenomenon, you were part of a group of people, conservatives, who were trying to, in a way, find the rational kernel of Trumpism and build it out into something that was more serviceable as a philosophy and as policy. And so at that point, you were kind of backing Trump, but famously very early in his administration, you came to the conclusion that, well, this really wasn't such a good idea. Trump was not a good representative of what you were trying to accomplish. And I think partly because of that, right, you started the American Affairs magazine to give voice to what you thought was a more positive and more intellectually stimulating and in-depth discussion of the issues that were at least raised by the Trump candidacy, but were not in any way resolved. So American Affairs, I think, has gone pretty far in that direction. And of course, there's a lot of different articles you've had in there, a lot of different perspectives. But I thought I'd concentrate on some of the things that you've written, Julius. And the first thing I wanted to discuss was, talking about the Democrats, because, hey, it's the DNC week. We would be remiss if we not dwell upon this festival of the people. You wrote a 2022 article in American Affairs called The Other Realignment. And there you discussed the possibilities for some kind of realignment within the Democratic Party that was sort of a new centrism that would break with progressivism as it's currently come to dominate the Democratic Party, and the ways in which, in many ways, it holds back the party. And you enumerated three different strands of this. One was sort of the liberal patriot style of liberal nationalism, which we've articulated in our Substack and related authors have written for us. Popularism, which is associated with David Shor. And finally, supply-side progressivism. So could you maybe just walk us through those different strands and, how they, what they constitute and how they differ from one another?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me on and that very generous introduction. The chronology you offered may have been a little bit inaccurate, but there's no reason to be pedantic about it.
Okay.
And thank you for summarizing that article to help me remember it. It's been a while.
Yeah, right. I always forget what I write, too.
But yeah, I maybe to take a little bit of a step back, there were kind of three waves of realignment, or the term realignment's been thrown around now for at least 8 years. Mm-hmm. And the first wave was a kind of Trump-Sanders sort of crossover. Back in 2016, there was, the Venn diagrams kind of intersected a little bit, and you could imagine a realignment sort of being driven by kind of those sides coming together against whatever the centrist establishment. And then as time went on, and as you described, Trump decided obviously not really to go in that direction. Then I think realignment really became seen as the populist wings of each party would take over their respective party and then drive a larger electoral realignment in the nation as a whole. That's never come close to happening. You can say that Trump has sort of taken over the Republican Party, but certainly did not drive a larger realignment. And then the last one is the option that I explored there, which I think there are currents of, though again, as I think pretty circumspect in the article in saying that this is more of a thought experiment rather than a prediction of anything. But it was, you could see, especially at that time, there were some democratic rebellions against wokeness and defund the police movements. There was a ferment on economic policy rethinking, as well as these kind of more campaign style popularism, let's not talk about the things that are unpopular, kind of potentially, theoretically could converge into a larger realignment where the center of the Democratic Party, which I think most people would say is still kind of the governing party, much stronger than the Republicans, much more capable of driving policy than the Republicans for various reasons, but that they could sort of really reshuffle their priorities. And you saw some of that, I think, at least in outline with some of the Bidenomics stuff, the early Bidenomics debates. But again, I don't think it ever really achieved liftoff or consummated itself. And so here we are today with a kind of 50-50 election, and one that I think, in contrast to 2016, is really sort of substanceless. It's, as they say, vibes. And while Trump has never been a sort of, PowerPoint 10-point plan guy, the kind of big ideological issues of 2016, from trade with China and foreign policy and economics, those have kind of dissolved a little bit, and here we are. No, you could say there's been some of a realignment, because the reason he can't really present a stark choice on China is because that's become consensus and so on. But nevertheless, I think that that path for the Democratic Party remains open, but they haven't quite taken it.
Well, just to play the devil's advocate here a little bit, if we look at where the Democratic Party is today and some of the things it stands for, and of course what the Harris-Walz campaign appears to be about, you can kind of see aspects of those three different things you enumerated that could feed into potential Democratic realignment. In terms of liberal nationalism, I mean, there is, as you just pointed out, taking on more of the, sort of being tough on China. There's some emphasis on industrial policy, of course. I want to get into that later. In terms of popularism, I mean, this is probably the easiest part for them to take on, right? Because popularism is really just talk about stuff that's popular. Don't talk about stuff that's unpopular, and you will be better off. So certainly the Harris-Walz campaign seems to have taken that on to some extent. And then I guess a tougher call is supply-side progressivism. We do see that as a current that's gained some strength in the Democratic Party, and there are sort of inklings of it in the Harris-Walz campaign. There's certainly more openness to doing things about making it easier to build stuff, including homes. What do you think about all that? Is it just like, sort of so small as to be insignificant, or are they at least moving in the right direction?
I think if I wanted to argue against that position, I'd probably just cite a number of articles from the liberal Patriot showing the weaknesses on a number of these issues. But I think on kind of the cultural side, you're seeing some of the popularism, but what you haven't seen is the so-called the mythological Sister Souljah moment, where you would have a clear kind of denunciation of maybe some of the identity politics excesses or things like that. I don't really see that. Maybe from Fetterman once in a while, but not really from the top of the ticket or what you might call the shadow party of the Democrats as a whole. And then on the economic side, I think I wrote a piece for you guys several months ago now. Again, I barely remember it, but I think one thing I mentioned in there is I think there remains, and it's not just in the Democratic Party, it remains in the American elite as a whole, a debate and uncertainty of whether we really want to embark on a fundamentally new economic direction and deal with China and deal with some of the problems of quote-unquote neoliberalism and the various costs that entails, or do we want to kind of maintain the 90s status quo in its dying breaths as much as possible? And I don't think the Democrats have really resolved that enough to be able to articulate the type of agenda that would really motivate a larger national realignment. They have only really been able to do it thus far on issues that fit in with kind of a green agenda, a sort of pre-existing Democratic commitment, which we can argue the merits of. But because of the partisan issues with that, I don't think it's quite enough to really establish them as the new economic center, so to speak.
Yeah, that seems reasonable. Actually, that brings me to another article that you wrote about the Democrats. It was actually in the Liberal Patriot, and it was called "Why Don't Democrats Want to Win?" And by that you meant, this very applicable to today's situation, surveying this grim, i.e. GOP landscape, an observer with knowledge of only the present state of the Republican Party would likely imagine that Democrats were racking up massive majorities and that Biden at that point, now Harris, Vice President Harris, was cruising to re-election. Why have Democrats failed to overwhelm a divided Republican Party? Democrats have shown little interest in exploiting the opportunity for a broader realignment on the order of Franklin Roosevelt or Ronald Reagan. So, what's that about, right? I mean, I think what you're basically saying there is, it's not a state secret. The Republicans are in pretty bad shape. I mean, the Trumpified Republican Party is all kinds of, wires hanging from the ceiling, contradictory things they stand for. They don't have much of a policy agenda. They're divided. There's a lot of people in the country who hate the kind of rhetoric and so on that Trump stands for. But despite all this, the Democrats are sort of fighting them to a draw at this point, even if you take a pretty optimistic view of where Harris currently is in the campaign. So what's holding them back? What are the things that are sort of interfering with their ability to do what needs to be done? Why aren't they reaching out to disaffected Republicans more than they are? Why aren't they willing to have some sort of sister soldier moments? What is the driving force behind their lack of interest and sort of trying to create this much broader popular majority?
Well, that's a big question. I think I'll start with some of the kind of narrower answers, and then there's maybe a larger academic theoretical question hanging out there that might explain it too. As I think I said in that article, it feels like it, and as a sort of outside observer, who's never been a Democrat or been involved in elite Democratic politics, it feels to me, or seems to me, that the Democratic center really has a difficult, if not impossible, time sort of standing up to the cultural commitments of the progressive left. They seem really dependent on that for some sort of moral legitimacy. And as a result, even though I meet many people in the liberal center, including many powerful ones that the head of significant institutions commanding a lot of money that they give to progressive left organizations, and they don't really like it. They don't really like what's going on, but they're not. There's maybe a collective action problem or something. They worry about what would happen if they were to publicly criticize it or take some other action that would go in the other direction.
They're scared of being called out as being racist, reactionaries, quasi-Trumpists.
Exactly. Yeah, it seems that way. I'm not really sure why, but they are. And then, as we discussed already, I think there is a genuine debate within the Democratic Party, within the country as a whole, about fundamental issues in economic policy. And there's a lot of Democrats who really aren't quite ready to let go of the 1990s Cold War consensus just yet. And as such, I think until that's resolved, it's hard for the center to really come together and present a united voice, much less a sort of coherent agenda for the country as a whole. And then the last one, I think, is a larger question. And it's one that you I think touched on in your latest book about the shadow party, which is a question about the nature of present day democracy and the extent to which anyone is really actually trying to build such a majority in the first place, where actual power derives from, things like that. And one can go down a lot of rabbit holes here, but it does seem that, racking up a big majority just doesn't seem to be at the top of anyone's mind. If the purpose of the system is what it does, then that's not what it's doing. So I think that would be my other speculation.
Is part of the problem that so many influential actors and constituencies in the Democratic Party and that shadow party to which you alluded, I mean, they don't really need to have a big majority to kind of get a lot of what they want.
Correct. I think maybe another way to phrase it, as the Republican Party has collapsed over the years into a sort of purely obstructionist party, in other words, some Republican donors have various idiosyncratic culture war issues that they care a lot about. But on the economic side, they really only care about blocking the Democrats, low taxes, stuff like that. And as that's happened, there's really not an elite lobby or constituency that wants to have any positive agenda in the Republican Party. And so anybody with a positive agenda goes to the Democrats or seeks to implement it through the Democrats. Of course, many donors, will donate to the Democrats on a positive agenda side and then also donate to the Republicans to block certain other things. So I think the absence of a sort of positive Republican alternative and unfortunately, Trumpian populism has not yet developed into that, though it still could. I think I'm more optimistic, actually, about younger figures like Vance and so on. But insofar as the Republican Party just doesn't really offer a positive alternative, every positive agenda is a faction of the Democratic Party fighting with each other. And as such, the party democracy isn't quite working like it's supposed to.
Why don't you talk a little bit more about you've basically contended that the Democrats haven't really broken with the neoliberal consensus that goes back to the 90s. But wouldn't people argue, well, hey, look at all the industrial policy kinds of things that the Biden administration did. You have Jake Sullivan, sort of openly talking about you need a break from the previous paradigm and trying to push things in that direction. So aren't they already sort of doing what you think hasn't been done? Or how do you interpret that?
They've certainly undertaken certain policies which represent a clear break from the past consensus. No one's disputing that. I would simply say that there are nevertheless significant factions in the Democratic Party, say represented by figures like a Larry Summers or maybe more recently a Reid Hoffman, that have much different visions for what democratic economic policy should be. And as a result, the Democrats, they're less unified on that point than they are on, say, certain culture war issues. And so they want to fight those battles rather than really lean into the economic policy agenda. And then the other piece of it, which I think the liberal patriot might appreciate, is I think Democrats are still, a lot of the post-neoliberal energies still kind of, they're not, again, this I'm painting with a broad brush here. It's not uniform. There are many differences within it, but they're not fully comfortable with the idea of economic nationalism or nation-state goals setting and driving economic priorities. And so post-neoliberalism can often mean just a kind of maybe more aggressive version of conventional democratic welfarist aims that I don't think has either the same substantive policy potential or the same political electoral unifying potential.
Yeah, I mean, I think you mentioned in one of your articles that this doesn't amount to what the Democrats have done and said to a focus on what you might call national development, toward a new national development paradigm. It's sort of obviously using government more actively, being willing to spend money, being willing to do stuff that looks like industrial policy, but it's in service of not necessarily that kind of goal. I mean, for example, look at all the investments and money and so on that have been put into the kind of green agenda, right? I mean, what motivates the actors within the Democratic Party who are pushing this is not a new national development paradigm. They have particular goals that are around decarbonization and the green agenda, and they're using the Democrats as the vehicle to do that. Is that kind of writ sort of, is that in essence the kind of thing that's going on with Democrats' industrial policy? It's in a sense not exactly prisoner, but it's really being shaped by these forces in the Democratic Party who are not particularly enthusiastic about economic growth per se or national development per se.
I might even try to complicate it further, which is that there actually is a lot of nationalism in some of this stuff, because one way to implement the green agenda is to say, we don't care who built, we don't care about American industrial base or any supply chains or anything like that. We can import solar panels cheaper from China. That's all that matters. Who cares if we ever build another car in this country again? China has better electric vehicles. And in fact, they've already, with the content requirements in the IRA and stuff, they've already effectively admitted that many of these nationalist economic goals do take precedence over, mitigation of climate change, strictly speaking. The fact is, though, that they can't admit that, at least not to their own coalition. And it's sort of a contrast to Trump, who talks about making America great again all the time, but for the most part simply doesn't care very much about policy, and it's all up in the air. And his first administration, I'd say, was a mixed record at best. But the Democrats can't really articulate what they're doing within a serious national economic framework. And so it ends up being the only thing they can do on those lines is stuff that they can sort of airbrush with older progressive rhetoric like the green agenda, even though, and they can't, it satisfies neither side, and it certainly doesn't satisfy the average voter.
Right. Given those constraints, which I think are real and have had an influence, how would you sum up at this point, I guess what we might call the good, the bad, and the ugly of the industrial policy agenda of the Biden era as it's as it started and as it's been implemented? I mean, for example, there was just recently these big Financial Times articles about how so many of the IRA projects are languishing in sort of development hell, as it were. So how do you sum it up? I mean, good, bad, and basically really ugly. So
I think I wrote yet another article for you probably almost a year ago in which I went into this in more detail. And so if people want a fully thought out, well articulated version of this answer, they may want to consult that. But in one sentence, I think the good is we could actually use the word industrial policy now, which wasn't really true 8 years ago. And we can have a serious debate about whether some sectors are more important than others, and whether sort of financial market-based capital allocation may not be perfect all the time. So that's massive progress, and now I think we're having the policy discussions around what would be the best industrial policy to have, not these kind of silly, abstract, theoretical debates with libertarians about whether you can even use the word or whatever. So that's the good. That's the good. The bad, I think, is certainly from a comparative study of successful industrial policies that have been implemented around the world or in American history versus what has been implemented in the last few years. I don't think what we've done would rank very well on that. The policies themselves, well, I think they will have positive effects. They're not especially well designed. They will be much less effective than they could be, as you've already alluded to. And I think, again, because of the internal dynamics of the Democratic Party or whatever, some of these things have leaned in more polarizing ideological directions, such as the environmental stuff, than would have otherwise, would have been optimal. The ugly, I think, is, outside of industries that have very well-functioning lobbies, namely semiconductors, environmental sectors, automakers, and universities, we've done very little. And, the fact is China has a shipbuilding capacity 263 times greater than the U.S. They build 21 submarines a year. We can barely build one. It'll take 7 years to replace the ammunition used in the Ukraine. If China were to invade Taiwan, the estimates from reputable think tanks and military exercises suggest we'd be out of ammunition in 7 days. China is now the world's largest auto exporter. They've continued to double down on manufacturing again. We are automating at a much lower rate than other economics would suggest. I could go on and on. But basically, we barely scratched the surface in addressing the fundamental capital allocation problems and industry problems that we have.
What's an example of countries that have done this better? And I do think you alluded to some of them in your article. Are there any models out there for how we might do this better, or models from our past, I suppose, in America?
Yeah, I think the standard models are the Asian tigers. Taiwan, Korea, China, of course, Japan, kind of the first one, Singapore. Another one very highly regarded is Israel, and what they did to build some of their manufacturing, high-tech manufacturing technologies. Certainly
talk about that, Julius. How did that work? Because I thought that was a real interesting sort of set of things they did, and I don't think people basically know about it.
Yeah, I mean, there is a kind of startup nation story about Israel that was, very popular in the 2010s, and it's true so far as it goes. And basically, it started. What Israel did is they basically took some government money and they seeded private sector venture capital funds to invest in certain sectors, and that succeeded, phenomenally by anyone's estimation. But the other part that they did, which is not often discussed, is they actually set up rules that require that any technology developed in Israel with government research support, which was most of them, if not virtually all of them, would have to be manufactured in Israel. And that actually led to investment and development of actual manufacturing capacity in Israel that otherwise would not have occurred. Now, over time, that policy was watered down to be a sort of fine for licensing offshore, and then they sort of got rid of it entirely, and you can check out American Affairs to read all about that. But it's especially salient today because the American model has been to focus entirely on intellectual property and then offshore the production abroad. So, Apple designed in California, made in China. For the iPhone, and actually, had we thought about the Israeli policy and approach to that earlier, we may have ensured that some of this intellectual property was actually produced here, and the investment and the jobs and the community benefits and so on would not all have left.
Yeah, so all of that stuff is sort of conspicuously lacking with the current U.S. approach to industrial policy. Thinking about, where we are right now and sort of the Harris-Walls economic program, insofar as we can even begin to make it out, it seems like, if we thought the Biden era industrial policy kind of lacked something, it seems like what's on offer is likely to be significantly less than that. Or do you think that's being unfair? Are there people lurking out there and the Harris-Walls hinterlands who really do have a plan?
Well, I think we've reached such a disjuncture in both parties between the sort of campaign rhetoric and actual governance that a lot of the policy stuff is a sort of side note, if not totally irrelevant to the campaign. And certainly there are, significant people, significant factions within the Democratic coalition that I expect would retain some influence. I don't know how much, but they wouldn't completely go away, certainly, in another Democratic administration. And who knows, they might end up driving policy. But the fact is that's not what the campaign is about. Nobody's talking about that, so nobody knows. And the same really is true on the right as well.
Yeah, okay, but if you had to speculate, obviously either one of these parties could win at this point. So let's say we have a Harris administration. What might you reasonably expect them to at least try to do? Not what they should do, but what they might plausibly try to do.
That's a difficult question because I have to separate what I would want them to do from what
I specialize in difficult questions.
They might do, and I'm not really sure. It's really
okay. We'll
really
talk. Yeah, go ahead.
Mike, from what I can tell, Harris doesn't, I don't know a nicer way to say this, but I don't think she really cares about policy very much. She seems to go out and say whatever she thinks she needs to say at the right time to appease whatever, whether it's the voters, the shadow party, whatever. Waltz doesn't seem interested in these issues at all, from what I can tell in his career. I think it's possible that you could still have significant industrial policies advance, but my guess is they would be driven probably more by Congress than the administration. I would expect this, they certainly wouldn't roll back anything, and they would probably, compared to Trump, I'm sure they would do a lot more on the environmental side for sure.
Sure, yeah.
But I think new stuff would probably not necessarily be led by them. It'd probably be more by Congress. But, without having any sense of, who the Secretary of Commerce is and whatever, it's very hard to say. Because I don't think Harris and Waltz, themselves seem to care too much about these issues.
Yeah, I tend to agree. What about, let's say Trump wins. Now you mentioned you had a little bit more faith in J.D. Vance and, that sector of the Republican Party. And, Vance would be the vice president. What might you expect they might try to do in a Trump Vance administration?
Yeah, I think that could be really interesting because, again, Trump doesn't seem to care very much about policy, certainly not policy specifics, but Vance does. And as a member of Congress, of the Senate, he's been, pretty effective, actually, at working across the aisle on a number of issues. I'm going to leave off discussion of any specific bills or whatever, but I think, a greater push on the defense industrial base, I think could be expected, including everything from, Wicker actually put out a proposal a month or two ago on massively expanding the defense budget, including procurement. I think there would be a lot of procurement reform in that. To more conventional measures around, subsidized lending and, subsidizing investment, that sort of thing, to more, targeted things on some of the specific technologies that they care about, particularly relating to kind of defense and aerospace and their supply chains.
So that seems a little bit closer, I'm guessing, to what, the should part of what you'd like to see, right? I mean, sounds like to you that would be a really important part of some preferred industrial policy that the U.S. might pursue.
Yes.
You want to expand on that and
No.
tell us a little bit more about what you think should happen? We won't hold you to it, man.
I think, they would obviously be much less focused on sort of some of the moralism around environmental policy and things like that, and looking at a much more kind of core productive technologies, and it wouldn't just be defense, but some of your kind of core manufacturing technologies, core biotech production technologies, things like that. I think, being it is the Republican Party, you're likely to see, I think, a little bit more effort, less of a kind of direct government subsidization, less building kind of a new government financial sector to do things, and more of a kind of effort to channel private sector capital, existing, private capital and institutions and investment into these strategic sectors, which I personally think is a more promising approach, though it doesn't have to be the only one. I think there are ideas and proposals underway. They're not public yet, and who knows where we'll be in a few months, let alone a few years. But I think that would be kind of the direction it would take, and you'd see a lot more kind of specific leveraging of the private actors, and at least rhetorically, less of a kind of government is deciding things.
One thing that you've argued in some of the pieces you've written is that, Democrats are kind of in this weird position where, they're the ones that have the competence. They're the ones that have a deeper bench of professional talent, technocratic talent. How might this work its way out in say a Trump-Vance administration did try to do some of these things? Would they be handicapped by the fact that they just don't have the bench that the Democrats do in terms of some of this technical abilities, approach, professionalism?
It might be. It depends how they go about it. I think on some of these issues, they're sort of bipartisan enough, or at least they could be. that you wouldn't have to rely entirely on kind of the Republican DC bench, which, is very thin. And it'd be fairly easy to recruit people from the private sector to kind of lead this, which I think, to its credit, the Biden administration has actually done a pretty good job of doing when it comes to specific implementation. And, there's risks there of, private sector capture or whatever, but I think that would likely be the only chance for them to overcome, the personnel hurdles that 50 years of anti-government rhetoric has imposed upon the Republican Party when it comes to governing talent. There's also, again, if they go about it in the right way, there are plenty of, shall we say, liberal patriots out there who I think would probably be happy to assist on some of the technocratic matters.
I think that's a good point. I mean, the kind of stuff we're talking about here, it does have more of a bipartisan potential, something people could agree on across parties and ideologies, whereas, a good chunk of the Democratic approach to industrial policy has been heavily invested in the sort of green transition stuff, which has been so completely partisanized and polarized at this point. It's really, it's intrinsically not bipartisan, whereas some of these other things could be, which would be definitely an advantage. But wouldn't Trump just sort of blow all this stuff up? I mean, you can never tell what this guy is going to do, right? I mean, maybe he'll just try to pass a bunch of tax cuts, but you think this is like the secret party, the secret administration? A lot of stuff could go on that would not be susceptible to Trump's weird interventions.
It's interesting. I mean, the one difference between this time around in 2016 is everybody sort of figured out that Trump doesn't care that much about policy. And so there's, millions of factions, countless factions within the Republican Party itself, never mind perhaps broader if he wins, that are, trying to be kind of the last person to talk to him and, sort of influence the direction of this unguided missile. And, we've already seen all kinds of chaos and infighting within, the staffing of the next administration. So that, that's going to go on, and you never really know how it's going to land. But I suppose one thing, what's interesting in this case is where, on the Democratic side, I think the shadow party is what you kind of have to fear. On the Republican side, depending on which version of it you get, when it comes to actually implementing policy, that is the one that is going to do it. And it could be the let's cut taxes and get rid of everything. But it might also be the we want to do industrial policy, and that does exist. Right.
Yeah. I mean, your friend and mine, Orrin Cass, seems to be a bit more optimistic about this potential than I sense you are. I suppose I am. Do you feel like Orrin's mini faction is making some progress these days? They did just hire that guy from the Heritage Foundation, from Heritage Action. I forget his name, but he's a real closely connected within the Republican Party. Are they becoming more serious players?
It's interesting. I mean, in some ways, they made a lot of progress and tremendous progress. I would say, kind of on the pure kind of intellectual debate side, it's night and day from what things used to be among kind of youngish DC wonks. I would if anything, they're kind of setting the agenda now. Where I think the road is much harder to travel is actually on the kind of corporate lobby side. Let's stipulate for a moment that individual donors to the Republican Party are probably never going to be very good on this stuff, because that's not why they're there. But the corporate lobby side is starting to get a little bit more diverse, and you may start to see some things on the defense industrial base side and things like that, where it's not just people angling for tax cuts. So I think that at this, the intellectual stuff has probably run its course. There are some battles left to win, but even winning them wouldn't necessarily change policy that much.
Interesting.
What you need is actually a base, to use a Marxist term, that actually wants this superstructure and wants to take advantage of it. And that has been absent in the Republican Party, but there may, one can be optimistic if you want to be.
That's a very interesting point that, some of these basic intellectual debates have really moved quite a bit in the last period of time. And people like Orrin Cass and you and others have really, are in a much better position in terms of making your points and having arguments taken seriously. Again, I think certainly been my experience among younger people in the DC universe, who I now know a little bit because I hang out at AEI, that there's definitely a lot of interest in all this stuff. But that and $1.60 will get you on the metro, right? You still got to have a base among people who have actually power and money and, so on and so forth. Do you see green shoots there in terms of some of these big players?
Yeah, as I said, I see green shoots. I think there's enough there to be optimistic if you want to be. I would, nevertheless, it's far from a settled thing or far from a victory as far as that goes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. Okay, well, I think we've covered quite a bit here, Julius. Anything else you want to tell us about what's coming down the pike at American Affairs and so on? To which, again, I urge each and every person listening to this podcast to subscribe.
I suppose I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that our new issue, our fall issue, actually came out today, August 12th.
Whoa! Now, what a coincidence! This is great.
Yeah.
Synchronicity.
Some pretty good stuff in there. A member of the FCC, Nathan Symington, has a really provocative and I think very good piece on China. China One, Now What is the title. We have some of our usual technocratic fare on industrial policy, some pieces on more cultural matters, education reform, and also some larger pieces exploring the trajectory of liberalism and Silicon Valley and American history. So something for everybody.
Absolutely. Hold on to your popcorn, everybody. This sounds like a crackerjack issue, and I look forward to reading it. So Julius, I want to thank you for being on the Liberal Patriot podcast. And I do think people owe it to themselves to become acquainted with your work and with the American Affairs, and I hope this will inspire more people to do so. And until I see you next time around the big town, I guess we'll just wrap it up here. Thanks again.
Thank you.